So I'm all right. Woohoo. All right. So I'm Terry Camerzell here on behalf of Creation Fellowship Santee. We're a group of friends bound, we're a group of friends who love to study God's word and believe the Bible, when read properly, disproves Darwinian evolution. We've been meeting on this online platform since May of 2020. Since meeting online, we've been blessed with 86 individual speakers covering creation science and other theology topics and even current events. Our goal is to equip believers to be ready to share their faith. You can find most of our past presentations by visiting tinyurl.com/CFS archives. That's C like creation, F like fellowship, S like Santee archives. Tonight we have with us Joseph Hubbard. Joseph is also known as Indiana Joe, and he's been working with Creation Research UK since 2014 and founded the Genesis Museum of Creation Research in 2013. He has a natural science degree in earth sciences, a qualification in zoology, and extensive experience in archaeology, geology, and biology. Joseph serves as the main representative for Creation Research UK, organizing itineraries and ministry trips. He also is an active speaker and writer for Creation Research and leads field trips around the UK. And if you are watching in Zoom or if you're watching on Facebook, if you have questions for him during his presentation, you can put them into the chat or comments there, and we'll ask them during the live Q&A at the end. With that, go ahead, Joseph.
Thank you very much, and hopefully you can all hear me. And let me just get my slideshow up and running. There we go. Hopefully you can see that all there. All right. Well, you can see our main website there, creationresearch.net, and we do have a Creation Research USA website as well, which is recently launched, which is creationresearchusa.org. So you can go and check that out. Brief little bit, a bit of an extra introduction, if you like, for me, with a few pretty pictures first. This is what I tend to spend most of my academic life nowadays doing, working out which pipes go into which bottles. That's a mass spectrometer, by the way, and this is currently part of my doctorate research, so I'm most of the way through earning a PhD. And what we do is we take fossils that we've excavated from all over the world, giant jaw bones and dinosaur rib bones and all sorts. You grind it down into a powder, you demineralize the bone, so get rid of the minerals, you digest the bones, you get rid of the inorganic substance, you're left with a solution that only has the organic stuff, and you run it through one of these machines. And the kind of things that we're finding are things like proteins, things like collagen. We're finding evidence of effectively original biomolecules is the correct term. Soft tissue is what it's often called. So we're looking for soft, squidgy stuff in bones that are supposed to be very, very old, and the soft, squidgy stuff really shouldn't be there if they are millions of years old. So you can find out more about the kind of work that we do with Creation Research at those websites. Every single week, we have a broadcast that goes out live on Creation Research's YouTube channel and Facebook pages and so on and so forth. We've got a new video streaming app that is launching in just a couple of weeks' time. But every week we have Creation Conversations that goes out. So it features myself, our international director, John Mackay, a few others researchers. We've got Dr. Glenn Wilson and Dr. Diane Eager and others as well. And we deal with a brand new topic every single week. So it's an hour and a half. You can come in and interact. Every week we deal with topics like origins of life, creation, evolution, archaeology as well. And then we will deal with the highly controversial topics, things like what is a woman? Which you might not think is that controversial, but we actually have a medical biologist who not only identifies as a woman, she actually happens to be one, and so she gave us an answer from both a biblical and scientific perspective. So you can find all of these resources on creationresearch.net or any of the Creation Research websites, and you can also watch it or listen to it rather on podcast form. We have a Creation Research TV, which again goes out currently on YouTube, live 24/7. It's all content Creation Research, goes out around the clock, and that will also be available very shortly on our streaming platform too. So Creationresearch.net is the place to go. And if you like what I'm saying tonight and you want to follow me in person, you can subscribe to my Telegram channel. That's the social media Telegram. And you can follow me, follow where I'm doing. You can find me at Joe Hubbard CR, see where I'm traveling, see what kind of research that we're doing. And research really is a very big part of what creation research does. Now, we have a big museums project around the world. There's currently 8 projects happening around the world, 8 museum projects happening around the world in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia. And this is our UK one. Great big fossils, beautiful dinosaurs. We have over 30,000 fossils and artifacts just in our UK collection, and we have slightly less, but getting on for the same here in the US. So we're trying to get it all sort of put together into museum form at the moment. Beautiful, great big fossils, footprint tracks, and things like Jurassic fossil squid. Now, you'd probably be able to identify that as a fossil squid just from the picture without my lovely label up there, simply because it looks like a modern one. Now, this is from the Jurassic Solnhofen in Germany. Jurassic simply means named after the Jura Mountains, which are in Germany. It's got nothing to do with millions of years at all. And the one thing that you know for sure is that even though these rocks here are supposed to be 159 million years old, all you've proven is that in 159 million years, squid have turned into squid. So A, you don't actually have any evidence for the millions of years, and B, even if they are real, all you've proven is that when God said 10 times in Genesis chapter 1 that living things would reproduce after their own kind, he was certainly telling the truth. Another fossil in our collection from this, again, the Solnhofen, the Jurassic fossils, you've actually got a southern conifer plant there on the left-hand side. That's a living fossil, again, 155 to 159 million years old, hasn't changed one bit. But then on the right-hand side, you've got an ammonite, one of those deep sea creatures. And we like to make the point over and over again at Creation Research, when you find deep sea creatures and land plants buried together, you have evidence of a flood. And bear in mind, these Jurassic rocks, the famous Jurassic rocks, are named after Germany. And you have, or the Jura Mountains rather, in Germany, and you have Jurassic rocks in Australia, in Germany, in the UK, over here in the United States. So this is certainly a global deposit, and it all formed in a flood. So you have very good evidence of a flood for sure. But you can come to our museums, you can get the full tour, you can explore the wonderful collections, and really what we're trying to teach people is all things are made by Jesus Christ. Because you see, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, it makes it plainly clear that Jesus Christ is the creator. Colossians 1:16. Not only were all things made by Jesus, but they were made for Jesus, and in Jesus all things consist or are held together. So you can check out creationresearchcenter.com. You can support the global museum ministry, not just the UK ministry, and sign up to the newsletters. We've got one going out in the US. We have a global one as well that goes out around the world, and it really will help you to see the importance of this work. Our tagline, where dragons praise the Lord, because they really do. Dinosaurs certainly do cry out the praises of the Creator. All right, our main topic for tonight is sort of climate change, a biblical picture, climate change, the God who controls the weather, climate change and creation. And we're going to start with a Bible verse. Let this mind be in you that is also in Christ, Philippians 2, verse 5. Now, it's a really important Bible verse because if we're ever going to get anywhere with the, let's face it, controversial and politically fueled topic of climate change and global warming, we really need to be making sure that as Christians, we have the mind of Christ in us. We're actually seeing the world God's way. So with that in mind, let's have a little bit of a look at just how controversial and on point this topic is nowadays. You remember the Ukraine invasion a couple of years back? It was big on most people's minds. Sky News, a big news channel in the UK, Ukraine invasion, will Putin start a nuclear war? And you had, all these kind of concerns going on around the world, particularly over here in the US. However, the Huffington Post suggested that perhaps a small nuclear war could be a good thing because it might reverse global warming. Now, I don't know how many people actually thought this was a good idea, but it does show you how pretty much any kind of topic, political activity can get twisted into being relevant in a global warming sense. In fact, if you want to come over to the UK, the King co-writes a children's climate change book just a few weeks ago, all about how we are destroying the world and we need to save the world. And just published a couple of days ago, this is again in the UK, published in the Telegraph, a very prestigious newspaper, just a couple of weeks ago. Teenager enraged by global warming plotted terror attacks. What was his motivation? Well, his grievances were motivated both by the hatred of government, well, I can understand that, but the ecological concerns is the worrying point. He points to pollution, destruction of forests, climate change, global warming, famine, and the exploitation of natural resources for minerals and gas. Young people are getting increasingly worried. Young people are getting increasingly frustrated. Young people are getting increasingly fearful, and this isn't something to really to mock or to, or how on earth can they believe this? I've seen the actual effects of this. Young people are terrified about the future because they've been told that they are destroying the planet. And it's down to them and only them to be able to actually save it. So that's what the newspapers say. That's what the media says. What the media doesn't say is that according to one of the major Antarctica scientific groups, South Pole has hit its record cold November temperatures. Record, the coldest it's ever been. In fact, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, Antarctica Research Journal made the claim just, late last year, the Antarctic ice sheet mass's gains are greater than its losses. In other words, the Antarctica ice is growing. But that's not that surprising. Creation research has been watching the Antarctica ice sheet for the last 15 years, and it's been, on the whole, growing overall. There's no doubt about it. The Arctic is shrinking, but the Antarctica is growing. The South Pole is growing. Now, I wonder why we haven't heard of things like this in the media. I wonder why these things weren't taken into account when describing the modern global warming climate change agenda. Well, this might give you a bit of an answer. Professor Chris Folland, a few years back, but he was a major contributing author to the global warming reports. He said this: the data doesn't matter. We're not basing our recommendations on the data, we're basing them on the climate models. It might give you a bit of an indication, a bit of an early indication, shall we say, of where some of this global warming thing has gone wrong. All right, back to the Bible then. Beware of false knowledge, Paul says to Timothy. Avoid the profane and idle babblings and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. By professing it, some have strayed concerning the faith. Now, if you open up your old King James Bible, you will see that that word knowledge there is actually science. And you shouldn't be surprised. Science is the old Greek word for knowledge. Beware of false science, Paul is telling Timothy. Beware of false knowledge. It will lead you astray. So yes, if we're going to get anywhere, we need to start with a biblical perspective. All right, IQ test. What have the following got in common? Noah at age 602, Abraham when he went to Egypt, Joseph at age 39, Jacob at age 130, and Moses at age 80. Now, there's something that connects all of these people at these particular ages. Any ideas? Well, the answer is climate change. It really is. Let's dig down into it. Noah, at the end of the flood, Noah comes out and God makes a covenant with Noah. And most of us remember the sign of the covenant, which is, of course, the rainbow. And some of us might remember the biggest part of that covenant, which is that God would never destroy the world again using water. But there was a lot more to that covenant, including dietary laws, what you could and couldn't eat, or rather you could eat everything that moves, but not their blood. But God also made this as a part of a covenant to Noah. For as long as the earth shall remain, God said to Noah, there shall be day and night, cold and heat, winter and summer, until the world ends. Genesis chapter 8, verse 22. Now, if you go and have a look at the beginning of Genesis, you find that God described the world as very good. And you and I tend to view the word good as a moral word, and it is, but it's a lot more than that, because God actually described what good meant. Good meant that all creatures were vegetarian. Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 and 30 tells us that. And in fact, God also describes Adam and Eve as being naked. and they didn't get sunburnt cancer, and they didn't freeze to death at night, so the climate was good as well. And you'll find that this reference in Genesis chapter 8 is the first reference that you have to major climate change. And you shouldn't be surprised, because you have the first ever major mechanism for major climate change, which is a global flood. Now, God promised Noah that for as long as the earth shall remain, there'd be day and night, cold and heat, summer and winter, until the world ends. Climate change. Okay, skipping forward to Abram, soon to be Abraham, when he went to Egypt, Genesis chapter 12, verse 10, there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. A famine has happened. Climate change. Oh, and if you think I'm being a bit facetious saying climate change just from this one little Bible verse, well, look at what it says in the scientific and historical literature. There is actually historical evidence for this. Middle East climate change, PNAS, a very prestigious academic journal, corresponding with the 4.2 to 3.9 BP, that's before present, abrupt climate change to a more arid climate has been recorded. This matches with the time of Abraham, and notice what they call it: climate change. In fact, Professor Harvey Weiss, professor of archaeology at Yale, beginning at around 4,200 before present, sudden demise of civilizations, including Mesopotamia, Canaan, and other Middle Eastern regions. Well, there's your Middle Eastern region, full of sand today, but it's actually been confirmed by sediment from throughout the Middle East. And it's not just your archaeological evidence, right? Your physical evidence of going and looking at the sands and the soil samples. You can actually get it from the literature of the time as well. The curse of Akkad. The large fields and acres produce no grain. The flooded fields produce no fish. Watered gardens produce no honey and wine. The heavy clouds did not rain. On its plains where once grew fine plants, lamentation reeds now grow. Yep, throughout the historical and the ancient literature of the time, it's quite clear now that after a period with a humid and warm climate, the precipitation, the rainfall, greatly diminished after 4,200 years BP in a littoral zone of the eastern Mediterranean. Yeah, Abraham, when he went to Egypt, he went there because of climate change. But then don't be surprised, climate change has something to do with Joseph and Jacob as well. Joseph was sent to Egypt as a slave, where he had a dream and told Pharaoh that 7 years of plenty, and then what? 7 years of drought. Climate change. In fact, because of his prophetic foreknowledge, Joseph was made the prime minister of Egypt, which actually allowed him to save his father and his brothers and his whole family, because Jacob came to Egypt at 130 because of that 7 years of famine, which is where they stayed. I wonder why Egypt features so heavy, though, in the scriptures. Well, you get a little bit of a clue. Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, and Hosea 11, verse 1, out of Egypt I called my son. It's mind-blowing when you see the connections and the threads that run all the way through scripture, and it has everything to do with Jesus Christ, from creation all the way through to Revelation. What about Moses? Well, Moses, he was a descendant of the children of Israel after they went into Egypt, and he was called by God to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt and into the promised land, a land that was described as a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, remember, Jacob and Joseph had come out of the land because of a famine, because there wasn't milk and honey. Milk, goats or cows, they require lush grass to produce good milk, particularly flowing with milk. Honey requires bees, which require good flowers, which requires a good climate. So the climate has changed in the promised land in Canaan since Jacob and Joseph left it. And it's changed 2 or 3 times since Abram left it. Climate change is there in the scriptures for sure. And if you want to find out more of this reference, you can go to creationresearch.net, click fact file, and search climate. There's a whole host of reports in there, or even better yet, sign up to the Creation Evidence News, where you can get the fact file, clips come through for free all the time. All right, what's the real issue when it comes to climate change? Who is your authority? Who has the right to decide? Who has control of the weather and the climate? And who is actually sovereign over all? Maybe you've heard of Extinction Rebellion. We had huge marches for Extinction Rebellion happening all the time in the UK, particularly in places like London. And a couple of years ago, we had COP26, which was the big climate summit up in Glasgow. We actually went up and interviewed a load of Extinction Rebellion. You see their logo there, Rebel for Life. Who are they really rebelling against? Well, it's time for some more Bible now, particularly Romans chapter 1. What does Romans chapter 1 say? They did not glorify God. They did not thank God. They became futile or foolish or pointless or worthless in their speculations. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. They'd exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they served the creature or the creation rather than the creator. That's what Extinction Rebellion does. They worship the creature. They worship the creation rather than the one who created the world and them and gave them rules to live by, and also promised that for as long as the earth shall remain, there'll be seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, and winter. Well, what's the consequence of this? For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. They exchanged the natural use of their bodies. They burned in homosexual lusts. They committed what is shameful. And in verse 32, such things are deserving of death. What's the big point? Well, those that worship the creation rather than the creator will be given up to evil. And those that worship the creation deserve to die. Ooh, harsh words. Hard words. Thankfully, not my words, because you can be locked up for saying stuff like that today. This is straight out of the Bible, I'm afraid. But before all of you go, well, I'm so glad I'm not like Extinction Rebellion and don't worship the creature rather than the creator. Just remember what Romans goes on to say: there is none that does good, no, not one. That's in chapter 3, verse 12. And in fact, a little further on in chapter 3, it says, all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. But there's the good news: all who believe are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. We're back to Jesus again. Jesus really is the answer to all of these questions about religion, about politics, about climate change, and about all the things that connect them together. So be wary of worshipping the creation rather than the creator. Well, what about some data? What about some science here? Published in the University of Leeds a few years back, Central England temperatures since 900 AD from historical records. And you can actually see, this isn't our chart, this is from the University of Leeds, very prestigious. This chart actually got replaced by the University of East Anglia because they were trying to push the idea that the climate has shifted massively up the warm side in the last couple of 100 years, and this chart basically disappeared. So we're grateful that we managed to get copies of it, but have a look at what they've actually recorded from historical records. History can be really useful sometimes. The Bible says there's nothing new under the sun, and it really does pay to learn your history. Going all the way back to 900 AD, yes, we have a very, very long and very rich history in the UK, which I'm very grateful for because it provides data like this. You notice one thing? There's a warm patch a bit towards the beginning. This is actually known as the medieval warm period. And despite critics' biggest attempts to try and claim that this was only a localized warming period, increasing evidence tells us that this was throughout most of the northern hemisphere. In fact, there's actually even evidence that the medieval warm period affected Australia as well. Skip forward in time, and in 1303 the Baltic Sea freezes, first time on record. In 1315 there were massive floods which were compared to Noah's day, and some claimed that it was judgment from God and revelation had begun. And in 1610 Galileo discovers sunspots. Now, what's all this got to do, sunspots? Well, sunspots are those funny patches on the sun that are actually cooler patches, and the more cooler patches there are, the hotter the sun is overall. Now, Galileo discovered sunspots in 1610, and the climate got cooler after that, and people recorded the volume of sunspots that they saw. I wonder if that tells us something. In fact, if you go and have a look at the whole chart, you can see that the climate has gone up, it's gone down, it's gone up, it's gone down, it's gone up, it's gone down, and now it's coming back up again. And you can see this throughout all of the UK's archaeology as well. I'm in an abandoned medieval village here in Dartmoor, down towards the south part of the UK. It was developed in the early 900s, mid 900s. It was abandoned in the 1400s. Why? Because it got too cold. the frost and the snow came and drove the people away. It was just too cold. It was warm enough when they built it at the beginning of the medieval warm period. Now, in the 1400s, it was too cold. Today, it's warm again. In fact, it's the south coast. It's known as one of the warmest areas in the whole of the UK. So don't be surprised that between 1645 and 1710, astronomers recorded a dramatic decline in sunspot numbers. Lower sunspot numbers means cooler sun overall. So don't be surprised that there was an area in that graph where the climate dropped drastically, and you have it known as the Little Ice Age. It was called the Little Ice Age because, well, everything froze over. In 1695, there was no open water in any direction around Iceland. Now, we're going over to Iceland in just a couple of minutes to show you some of the research we did over there, but no open water, all frozen. We don't get that today. Something else we don't get today is the Thames freezing over. 1677, it was first recorded. The Thames froze over. They had a frost fair out on the Thames. People bought whole, carts and fairground rides and all sorts of stuff out into the middle of the Thames because it was so frozen. Climate in art, Venice, 1707, frozen water. And in 1814, you had the last ever frost fair on the Thames. It's never completely frozen over since. And if you want the big picture, take a look at our modern day graph, right? The bit of the modern day. It still hasn't got back to be as warm as it was at the medieval warm period. Now, this is just from 900 AD. We have an older history than that. We go all the way back to the Romans and beyond. And the Romans came over and they made the first real records of the climate. The Roman general Agricola said the climate, talking about Britain, right, is wretched with its frequent rains and mist. Yeah, no change there. But there's no extreme cold. The soil will produce good crops, except olives, vines, and other plants which usually grow in warmer lands. Well, that was when the Romans first ever went over there. By the mid-Roman period, about a couple of hundred years later, the Romans had actually taken Mediterranean grapes over to the United Kingdom and were growing them as far north as the Scottish borders. Now, we have a few vineyards today in the UK. Most of them have been bred, right? The grapes have been bred to cope with our cooler climate. The Romans simply brought over Mediterranean grapes. And by the middle of the Roman warm period, which was about the middle of the Roman Empire, 150 odd years after the first invasion, they were growing grapes as far north as Scotland. In fact, if you want a technical paper, again, 2 millennia of North Atlantic seasonality and implications for Norse colonies. What do they basically say? Well, they've found some records from oxygen 18 values, and you can see that there were warm periods and there were cool periods. So even the archaeological data taken from soil samples tells you that there were warmer periods and there were cooler periods, up and down and up and down. This is the Viking Age, right? 1719 to 1070. And it had nothing to do with man pumping loads of carbon dioxide into the upper atmosphere. In fact, we have 2,000 odd years worth of climate records from the Romans down to the modern day, and all the way through. You can measure the volumes of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere based off of soil samples, and you find that the CO2 has been constant. In other words, something else has changed the climate in the past. Now, creation researchers' biggest critic for many years, he has been a vocal critic of creation research, particularly John Mackay in Australia, is geology professor Ian Plimer. However, he got on the wrong side of the woke crowd a few years back because he said this, and I completely agree with him. If natural forces drove warmings in Roman and medieval times, how do we know that the same forces did not drive the late 20th century warming? But then why be logical? Why answer? Why let facts interfere with a good fairy tale? I like it. Even though he's the biggest critic, he's certainly on point here. All right, go into some scriptures again. Prove all things. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Actually go out and test things. Actually go out and investigate. Well, that's what we did in 2020. COVID, middle of all that. I was actually over here in the US, in 2020. Lots of panicking. I was supposed to be flying one way around the planet, right? I flew from the UK to the US. We were supposed to do Canada, over to California, and then we were supposed to fly around to Australia and New Zealand. And then I was supposed to arrive home in time to get married in 2020. Well, we did get married in 2020. It was a bit of a worry. I managed to first and foremost get back to the UK because of cancelled COVID events and everything. And then it was illegal to get married for 3 months in the UK. Because of COVID. So that caused an awful lot of stress. But we got there in the end. And we had a brief little break soon after we got married, but we wanted a proper honeymoon. And the only country that was really opened up after COVID was actually Iceland. So we packed our stuff and went over to Iceland. I made the mistake of letting our international director know I was going to Iceland, and he promptly sent me a load of work to do. Research and things to go and check out, right? I was very happy to do it because it really was fascinating. And about halfway through, I said to my new wife, you know what, dear, this would make a wonderful documentary. How do you fancy filming one? Well, she's a long-suffering and very gracious wife. So we did indeed film a documentary called Fire and Ice, all about the historical side of climate and the biblical picture of climate change seen particularly in Iceland. So you can go and order Fire and Ice. It's available in the US and around the world, and it will soon be up on our new streaming app. So check out Creation Research Live as well. But as you travel around Iceland, you can see us up the top of a glacier there. We were actually doing some testing. Very full of tourism. Its biggest income, basically, in Iceland is tourism. So everywhere you go, you see these great big plaques like this telling you about the local area, particularly telling you about climate change and the effect that climate has had on Iceland. Here's the claim that they make. Global surface temperature has increased by 1 degree centigrade on average since pre-industrial times, and considerably more in the Arctic. All right, there's the claim, but what are the actual evidences for this? Well, you can see the evidence for global warming. You can see the evidence for climate change. It's pretty stark. There you can see at the top a picture in 1935. There's a great big glacier running down the mountain. Skip forward to 2015, it's pretty much disappeared. And it's not just here in Iceland, it's elsewhere around the Northern Hemisphere as well. In Switzerland, 2006, lovely glacier there, 2018, disappeared. But then they go one step further and they make this claim. The main cause of global warming is anthropogenic, so that's man-made emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases due to what? The combustion of fossil fuels, power plants, transportation and industry, decreasing the uptake of CO2 by deforestation and agriculture. In other words, climate change, global warming is man's fault. That's the claim. It's because of our activities we've managed to change a global climate to the point where it is now destroying the world. Okay, here's Murdashokkal Glacier in South Iceland. We actually climbed up this glacier and went over it. And the guide there who'd lived there most of her life told us that when she first joined this glacier, pretty much covered that entire valley there. There was no water at the front of it at all, and this new lagoon had been formed in just her lifetime. There's no doubt about it, the glaciers are melting in the northern hemisphere and the climate is warming up. And it pays to dig a little bit deeper. BBC News, August 2019, a report on glacier extinction. Ireland's Okiokul Glacier is commemorated with a plaque. Mourners have gathered in Iceland to commemorate the loss of Okiokul. The glacier was officially declared dead in 2014 when it was no longer thick enough to move. They held a funeral for the glacier. Where's the evidence of the glacier? There it is in 1986 at the top. Lovely, great big glacier on the top of Manoch. And then by the bottom, you can see that Okiokul has pretty much disappeared and you are left with very little ice at all. Just a few patches here and there. Well, we went to check it out. We wanted to go and make sure. And indeed, there's Ok volcano behind us and the glacier is no more. It was once where I was standing. The glacier Okiokul is now extinct. Well, we filmed this for our documentary, and it was worth digging again a little bit deeper into the BBC News article. Look what they had to say. 150 years ago, no Icelander would have been bothered the least to see all glaciers disappear as they advanced over farmlands and flooded areas with meltwater and streams. Okay, what does that tell you? 150 years ago, the glaciers were growing. They were taking over farmlands, and most people would have been happy to see them go. All right, let's have a look at one step further, because I mentioned a quote to you earlier about the mourners who had gathered, but I left a little bit off. Let's fill it in. Mourners have gathered in Iceland to commemorate the loss of Jökull, which has died at the age of about 700. Okay, question, how do they know that the glacier was 700 years old? Answer, people were there when it was born. The Vikings, right? In fact, we have Viking historical records of when they moved into Iceland. It was much warmer. They were able to grow cereals. They were able to grow crops. You can't do that today in Iceland. Only a few places where you have the hot springs that they manage to grow, but they don't produce very much at all. And the Vikings recorded the coming of the cold in the 1300s when you had the glaciers suddenly grow. This glacier was born in the 1300s, died in the 2000s. It's climate change. That Jökull glacier, which we climbed up, there it is there. The greatest extent, it was recorded in 1890. Today, it's now melting. Climate change for sure. Oh, but the one thing that they don't tell you again is just a couple of years ago, Iceland's major glaciers have all expanded in the last 12 months, and they're expected to continue. There's no doubt about it. If you look over at wide scale over the past 150 years, there's been a melting and a changing climate, but it is a fluctuation for sure. And this is not a unique occurrence. Jökulsárlón Glacier has grown for the third year in a row, and science attribute the change to cool ocean waters, a major glacier in Greenland. Yep, it grows, it goes up, it goes down. And the biggest claim for all of this is that it's melting because the oceans are getting warmer. And in 2018, at about the same time, you had a major paper published in Nature, one of the most prestigious, if not the most prestigious journal in the world. Quantification of ocean heat uptake from changes in atmospheric O2 and CO2 composition. Load of jargon, but really the claim of the whole paper was oceans are warming at a greater rate than previously believed, and it's all because of man-made climate change. This paper got major, widespread media coverage. CNN, New York Times, BBC News, across the world. Major global coverage. Within days of publication, statistician Nicholas Lewis found serious errors with the calculation and actually showed that global warming, ocean warming, is no greater than previous estimates. Almost a year later, paper five, whoops, Daisy, that wasn't supposed to happen. Let's try that again. Hopefully that's come back up for you again. Whoops. It's not working, never mind. Hopefully you can see that. There we go.
Yes, we can see the slides again.
That's good, thank you. It was finally retracted almost a year later in a very tiny little retraction note, and that was basically it. There was no other mention of it. It didn't get any media coverage, nothing whatsoever. So yes, data is fraudulent sometimes, and mistakes certainly do happen, but do you think that that helped the public realize the mistake? Now, it didn't at all. All the public took away from it was that the global warming is happening and that the ocean warming is happening, and it was all our fault. Well, let's get back to a bit of a biblical perspective on this as we begin to round up, because again, as I mentioned before, the Bible tells us in the beginning God created. He created all things, and God created the world very good. Genesis chapter 1. Good meant no winter, no summer, no drought. And you can actually see evidence of this, of a good climate in the past, if you want to dig deep enough into Iceland's climate past. Here's a picture that I took in Iceland. Can you see the volcanic rocks, the big black rocks on the top? Underneath, you've got the red fossil soil. Now, I was driving, we were on a 10-hour round trip up to one particular location because I knew there was only one area in the whole of Iceland that you could find fossils. And on the way up there, as I was driving, I suddenly swerved off the road and parked up, and my wife was a little bit worried. I was trying to get to see this red fossil soil that I'd spotted. What is it? It's lateralization. Now, I'd seen lateralization before this red fossil soil. I'd seen it before in Australia, historically or mostly a hot and dry country. And there you can see the lateralization in Australia, down in Mount Archer. The red is due to iron, and it's due to a hot, wet climate. Now, Australia certainly has a hot climate, but it's not a wet one anymore. And we found the same thing in Iceland. And Iceland is a wet climate, but it's not hot. So at some point in both Iceland's and Australia's history, the climate has changed. This is a fossil soil which is telling us that the climate used to be hot and it used to be wet. And the Lord prevailed because we managed to, against all odds, find the one tiny little location where there is fossils to be found. And we couldn't find our way in, but a local not only showed us where the fossil hunting was, but also allowed us to go into the main museum. There's a tiny little museum out the way, but we actually saw some of the fossil plants that were found in Iceland. And you might recognize some of these fossils. This is the birch. And there's some interesting little quotes as you go around the museum. Things like, what was the climate like here? Making the point that these tree species, although the individual species are extinct, their relatives, so the same kind, their living fossils, now thrive at more southern latitudes in tropical and subtropical coniferous forests. Tropical and subtropical, I tell you what, I've been to Iceland. I wouldn't describe it as tropical or subtropical. In fact, the average temperature requirements for these plant groups are up to 15 degrees centigrade. Now, to put that into perspective, the UK has an average temperature of about 9 degrees centigrade. Iceland has an average temperature of about 3.5 degrees centigrade. And so 15 degrees centigrade average temperature puts you at a Mediterranean climate, right? South of France, Italy, that kind of climate, miles away from what Iceland currently is like. Now, these fossil leaves, by the way, we were able to get our own sample. They're now in our museum collection, and they make a really important point. At some point in the past, Iceland was Mediterranean, subtropical, average temperature of 15 degrees centigrade, with modern-looking plants, living fossils, no change at all. Climate change, up and down for sure. Vatnajökull Glacier was recorded as being born 2,000 years ago, the coming of the Great Ice Cold. And in the 850 AD, the Vikings arrived. They grew cereals and they farmed. They documented a warmer climate. They documented when it got cooler, and they documented when it warmed up again. Because by the time you get to the medieval period, the medieval warm period, you have churches that were built with no fireplaces. And it got so cold that they actually had to install a modern heating system. An even older one, built in the 1200s, again, a medieval church. No chimney, you notice, no fireplace inside. They didn't actually need one. It was warm enough to cope without it, because this was the medieval warm period. So even the culture tells you that the climate has changed. Now, if you want to take all of these points of reference, all of these points of data from the last from all records effectively, and put it into a biblical perspective, you end up with a chart like this, Iceland's climate chart. Now, let me just get a little laser pointer here, which you can hopefully see. You can see over here, you have the fossil leaves, average temperature of up to 15 degrees centigrade, and we have a warm tropical to subtropical climate. By the time you get to the Ice Age, recorded across most of the northern hemisphere, the temperature plummets. And it goes up and down, and here's your medieval Roman warm period rather. There's your cold where you first get the major glaciers. There's your medieval warm period when the Vikings are here, and it goes up and down to the Little Ice Age when there's no clear water around Iceland, all the way up to today. Interesting when you put it into a biblical perspective, what it actually looks like. But you see, you only notice or only get given this kind of data. The Met Office global average temperature from 1850 to 2011. Look at that shocking rise. Yeah, it's gone from cold to hot in just the last, 150 years or so? But you need to zoom out and get the big perspective. Don't just look at the data that helps your case. You want a biblical perspective of global climate variation. In the beginning, everything was very good. man sinned and the world changed from good to bad. The world got so bad that God sent a global flood to judge mankind. And you have up and down and up and down and up and down ever since then. And the bit that they're only really interested is the climate variation of the last 150 years. Now, there's no doubt about it. The climate is warming today, but it warmed far faster in the past and it cooled far faster in the past. And it was nothing to do with mankind's activities in the slightest. Climate change is definitely recorded in the Bible. Temporary global warming is only one part of it. But all historical warming and cooling to date has got nothing to do to cars, cows, or industry. And remember, by both Iceland's records and the UK's records, it still hasn't got to be back as warm as it was in the medieval warm period. Remember what I mentioned? Where's this graph now? It disappeared once it was replaced by the famous chart published by the University of East Anglia, which claimed that the warming has never happened like this before. The reality is that graph was proven to be fraudulent in a major court case to the point where they couldn't prove where they got their data from, but it's still being used in the political sciences today. Well, I'm from the UK, big long history, right? Let's finish up by looking at a great overview. You see, we have a record of when the humans first arrived in the UK. We have their footprints in the peat beds underneath major glacial deposits. Yeah, the humans arrived and the peat records that it was a warm subtropical climate. From the plant fossils that you find there, they hunted great mammoths, but there is now covered by major glacier deposits because the glaciers came over Norfolk during the Ice Age. By the time you get to the Celts in the Iron Age, the Celts are wearing skirts up in Scotland, and you wouldn't want to necessarily do that too often today. By the time you get the middle of the Romans, you had Romano-Scottish grapes being grown on the Scottish borders. By the time of the Vikings, it had cooled a bit, so they could only grow it in the southern area, but it was still certainly warmer than it was today. You had cathedrals and churches which were built without any kind of heating provision, fireplace or otherwise, because simply they didn't need it. And it got cold to the point in the Little Ice Age in the 16 to 1800s where you could have a party on the Thames every year. And today we have Greta Thunberg telling us that unless we use a special light bulb, the world will be destroyed. Well, I want to finish with a really biblical point. So I'm going to read just a couple of verses from 2 Kings chapter 3. 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 all the way through 18. Bit of context, have the king, the good king, in Israel, and the Moabites have actually come to invade, and they've done the classic medieval technique, right, of holding a siege. They have surrounded the city of Jerusalem, and the people inside are getting desperate for food, and they're getting particularly desperate for water. So what does the Lord say? Verse 16, and he said, "Thus says the Lord, make this valley full of ditches. For thus says the Lord, you shall not see wind, nor shall you see rain, yet that valley shall be filled with water, so that you and your cattle and your animals may drink. And this is a simple matter in the sight of the Lord. He will also deliver the Moabites into your hand." You see, if you want the really biblical picture, it's the picture of God as sovereign over all, including the climate. And the reality is the children of Israel had to step out in faith and dig the ditches, but God promised them that you will not see rain, you won't see flowing water, you won't see the normal climate things that bring you water, but those ditches will be filled with water by the morning. And this manipulation of climate like you've never seen before is a simple matter in my sight. In fact, to prove it, I will deliver the Moabites into your hand. This is the same God, by the way, who stood up on the boat in the Sea of Galilee and said, "Peace, be still," and there was instant climate change. And it's the same God who promised Noah way back in the beginning that as long after the flood, as long as the earth shall remain, there will be seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, and winter. Nothing about the world burning up in a great big global catastrophe. Until you get to the right end where you deal with the global warming you really should be concerned about, which is when the earth is going to be consumed by fire. So you want a biblical perspective? No, leave the climate in God's hands. Mankind is not anywhere near being able to be powerful enough to manipulate global climate, but make sure that we serve the Lord in actually building his church so that when that earth is consumed with fire, we have a promise of a new heavens and a new earth, which we will be going to there with Christ. A reminder, creationresearch.net. Click on the fact file and search climate. You can follow me at Creation Research, Joe Hubbard Creation Research, if you want to follow us on Telegram, and continue to check out Creation Conversations and the other programs that we have as well. Well, I'm going to round up to a close there now and hand back to any questions if there are any.
Oh, there certainly are some questions. So
And I want to quick say, and I'm already breaking my rules here. Thank you very much, Joe. That was really good. And I could have listened to more of that. Thank you. Okay, Terry.
Thank you.
Okay, that was very good. So we do have some questions. So you mentioned something about it being illegal to get married for 3 months.
Yes.
And Robin would like to hear more about that.
Okay. When COVID first became very serious, I had to try and escape back to the UK, and there were worries that borders were going to close, and there were stories of planes, going to countries where borders were closed and they were sent back. Anyway, I managed to get there safely, and the UK never closed its border. But what they did do is they made a rule of 6, okay? And before that, they made the rule of 2, which meant that you weren't allowed any more than 2 people from separate households to meet together at any point. Now, to get legally married in the UK, you need at least 5 people, I think it is. You need the bride and groom, you need 2 witnesses to sign the papers, and you need an officiator, somebody to legally marry you, right? A registrar. So you need a minimum of 5 people. Most of those people are going to be from separate households, right? So in effect, it was illegal to get married for 3 months in the United Kingdom. There was no legal way that you could get married. It got very frustrating, and it shows you, number one, the UK government's opinion on marriage, because their excuse was that, well, a wedding is just an excuse to have a party, not the basis of the family. And secondly, and even more frustratingly, they opened up. I've got to be careful how we phrase this, because it wasn't phrased in the most savory way by even the government, but they basically allowed boyfriends and girlfriends and separate household partners to get together for relationships before they allowed marriage, and that really angered me. So yes, it was illegal for about 3 months to get married in the UK.
I was going to say, what was it? So I mean, obviously that was frustrated, but did you think that was wrong?
Oh yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I understand in part. I mean, looking back, hindsight is a great thing when we look in hindsight back to COVID, and without going into all the COVID and stuff, the reality was nobody knew really what was going on, and most people were following the advice of the World Health Organization, which was probably not the greatest of ideas in hindsight. But the fact that they had made marriage and getting married illegal, even in its most basic form, which is 5 people in a room together and you sign a piece of paper, it just shows you the lack of respect that we have for any kind of biblical basis around the family unit as a man and a wife together. And even to the point where they allowed casual relationships. I think that was one of the phrases they called it, before marriage, where you did have multiple people coming together from other households and marriage was still illegal. It was just ridiculous, in my opinion. But there we are.
Thank you.
It's over now.
That whole period of history sure showed a lot of.
It was interesting, wasn't it? Yes.
It forced a lot of hands. I mean, it was very revealing, and I don't think obviously our world will never go back to what it was before. Too many things changed. So, Robin also is asking if you've been following, more back on topic. Have you been following the recent seismic activity in Iceland?
Moderately. I've been watching the volcano. It's been sort of going on and off for the last 6 months or so now. But yeah, it's the big one which we all want to be waiting for is the big volcano in the middle, which is I think it's Vatna it's called, but it consistently went off every 110 years, almost to the day, and it hasn't gone off for nearly 200 years. So everybody's sort of waiting for that one to go off, and that will disrupt an awful amount of air traffic all over the world. And interestingly enough, it will throw more carbon dioxide into the air than most of what we've ever contributed over the course of human history. So there we are.
Well, with that, our next question from Heinz is, what's your view on the relative contribution of the major greenhouse gases to global warming, such as water vapor, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide?
Okay, well, water vapor is your biggest one. It is the worst greenhouse gas in terms of has the greatest effect, right? And we do very little to contribute water vapor into the atmosphere. The biggest contributor to water vapor into the atmosphere is the sun, because it's a massive burning ball in the sky, and we're a very large planet full of water. So your sun temperature fluctuations are going to affect water vapor far more than we're going to affect water vapor. In fact, our effect on water vapor is nothing compared to the sun, and really it's water vapor which affects the climate the most. You know this if you're a gardener, because if it's springtime, right, and you've got all your plants outside and it's a completely cloudless night, i.e. there's very little water vapor in the atmosphere, you're going to be running around trying to save your plants by covering them up with mesh and cloches because the frost is coming. If it's a fully clouded night, so there's lots of clouds in the sky, you know it's not going to ever freeze. So that's your first point with water vapor, right? It's going to have a lot more to do with the sun. With regards to CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, argon is another one, and the like. What you are dealing with first and foremost is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction compared to the rest of the atmosphere. Now, if you go back into history, okay, we have got amber samples. Amber is fossilized resin. It has little inclusions, little air bubbles in it. You can put those amber, crush it into a mass spectrometer, and measure the volume of both carbon dioxide and oxygen in past environments. So this is a record of climate, or rather a record of atmospheric gas percentages from before the flood, right? So what was it like in the good world that got it originally created? And you find that both the carbon dioxide and the oxygen percentages were higher. Now, that produces a denser climate, a healthier climate, a climate which is better for plants. And you know this because commercial greenhouses pump them full of CO2. And as a result, not only does the CO2 go up, but the oxygen levels go up as well, because the plants are healthier and produce more oxygen. So more CO2 is not actually necessarily a bad thing. And we know from the past that there was much higher concentrations of CO2. Now, in terms of what our contribution is in changing the climate, we have never seen any evidence that, first and foremost, climate change or global warming is produced by CO2 increases and other increases. Because, like I say, we have a record of climate change across the past history, last 2,000 years, and the CO2 levels have remained constant. So something else affects climate, not just CO2. Secondly, in fact, we know that CO2 was higher in the past and it was a healthier climate. Secondly, we certainly see evidence of localized climate change. So what's the contribution? Well, case in point, London smog, Hong Kong smog, Tokyo smog, right? These are all effects of major emissions, lots of vehicles, lots of industry. It produces a change in climate, but it's a very localized change. It's not affecting much beyond that city. Can we change that climate? Sure we can. We did it in London, make rules about emissions, clean out the Thames, and you end up changing the climate so that it's a healthier climate. They need to do that in Hong Kong and Tokyo. So we certainly can manipulate climate on a very low level. We cannot manipulate it, and have never seen any evidence of being able to manipulate it on a global level, particularly when you see that the major contributing factor is water vapor, and that has everything to do with the sun and nothing to do with what we do.
Oh, it's a very thorough answer. Okay, and then Linda is asking, how did we get the worldwide temperature data for the graphs from hundreds of years ago?
Okay, well, it wouldn't have come in centigrade or Fahrenheit because neither of those were invented. But what we do have is a way of being able to create a relative temperature gauge based off of historical records about what happened during the time, right? So if you have, for instance, a historical record of the entirety of the sea around Iceland being frozen, you're able to work out what that temperature would need to be in order to be able to produce that. Likewise, if you're growing plants that require an average of 15 degrees centigrade, that's Mediterranean subtropical, in order to grow, and you find a record of those plants growing, you know that the temperature range is going to be within that. Likewise, the Romans recorded a warm, wet climate for Britain that ended up getting to the point where it was a warmer, drier climate, because you can record things like, relative temperature and relative rainfall based on what plants you grow, i.e., vines growing up on the borders of Scotland, right? So we're not dealing with something that is the Romans recorded it was an average of 10 degrees centigrade or something like that. But you do have a record of what they were able to do with the climate that they were living in. You then work out a parameter. So if you remember on the graph, the 900 years of climate history, you had the graph which went up and down, and then you had some dashed lines which went and kind of followed exactly the same pattern, but they were kind of high either side. That's the lines of uncertainty. In other words, okay, if you have grapes growing, what's the coldest grapes could grow, what's the warmest grapes could grow, that gives you a much wider range, and then you take an average from in the middle of it. So it still is the same. It doesn't make any difference which side you go because it's all about relative to each other. The point that it was warm and then it got cooler. Exact details, it doesn't matter as much. But what it shows you is that climate has changed up and down over the past. So the historical records are a really, really important part of getting the big picture on climate change. Because if the historians and the climate scientists had ever sat down together, modern day man-made global warming would have never been a thing.
Yeah, that's okay. Great answer. Great information that you presented to us. And we're going to go ahead and wrap up our time for the public side of things. You could stay back, and if people have questions here in Zoom, we can ask some of those. But to go ahead and wrap things up for the public, if you'd like to share one more time how people can find you and support your ministry and work, go ahead and do that.
Absolutely. You can find us at creationresearch.net. That's the main website for Creation Research. You'll find links to all the different websites. If you're in the US, it's creationresearchusa.org. Follow us on Creation Conversations. Sign up to the free UK newsletters. And also, I will be in the United States until mid-March. We have most of an itinerary filled, but if you would like me to come and speak at your church or your group, then you can get in contact with us through those websites. You'll find contact forms on there, or you can email us at creationresearchusa info at creationresearchusa.org, info at creationresearchusa.org, and can request ministry. We have a few midweek meetings, I think one Sunday, which we've still got to be filled up.
Great. Perfect. All right. And then once again, we're Creation Fellowship Santee, and you can find a list of our upcoming speakers by typing in tinyurl.com/CF Santee, C like creation, F like fellowship. Santee is spelled SANTEE. Next week, we'll be having Dr. Jason Lyle come and present for us on how we got the Bible. So stay tuned for that. With that, we're going to go ahead and sign off.